Hello and welcome to the second season of Gerety Talks. My name is Susie Ongai and I am the co-founder of the Gerety Awards, the awards redefining creative benchmarks. With this series, we aim to put in the spotlight the industries through changemakers with a refreshing take on what leadership looks like. Today, we welcome Grace Francis, Chief Experience Officer at Karmarama, which is part of the Accenture Interactive. Grace has previously held similar roles at Droga 5, WPP and Dentsu Aegis. They also teach on the ethics of empathy at HyperIsland and UAL, as well as founding the mentoring practice elsewherestudio.org. Welcome, Grace, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, it's really nice to be here.
So on your LinkedIn profile, I read a Chief Experience Officer has their fingerprints on everything and their signature on nothing. Can you tell us about this and what is exactly your role as Chief Experience Officer at Karmarama?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Chief Experience Officer is still a relatively new title in the C-suite. We're seeing it more in creative agencies and consultancies, but there aren't that many of us. And for me, the idea of having your fingerprints on everything, but your signature on nothing is essential. To be a Chief Experience Officer, you need to let go of all sense of ego. You're sitting in a room with a Chief Creative Officer, with a Chief Strategy Officer, and you're making room at the table for yourself that hasn't previously existed. And I think that's about recognizing that a Chief Experience Officer needs to be bringing a different type of work to the table. When I look at briefs, when I look at brand experience briefs, we have the opportunity to do anything that changes the business itself or changes the brand. You can pull any lever you want to and see what happens. That's a huge amount of accountability, but it's also a huge amount of freedom. And so really, I'm leaning over and getting involved in everybody else's jobs. And for that, you do need to be humble, and you do need to say, I want to get involved, but I don't need to have my name on something. So it becomes quite literal. I also think there's an element for anybody's job in leadership where it's really important to be a safety net for the people beneath you and work in a room where if a good idea comes out, it's their good idea, it's not yours. It doesn't matter what you put into it. And so following that approach through, whether I'm sitting with a bunch of other leaders or I'm sitting with some interns and anyone in between, the idea of saying what I contribute is freely given to the room is really important to me.
Okay. And how did your previous jobs and experiences prepare you for your actual role?
I think this role hasn't existed again for that long. So really, I've very much enjoyed being in roles where nobody knows what it is. So I started off in big tech and I was working in content, and then I was working in product and UX. And slowly this title started to emerge from that space. And I've very much enjoyed working with people who are also trying to determine what space are we taking up? Why do we need to exist? Why does our role need to exist? And why does our discipline need to exist? And that's really helped me get to a space where today we're able to introduce brand experience to our clients and to talk about it in a way that has significance beyond the products that they sell and often the campaigns that they create.
Okay, and you also mentioned in an article when referring to some of your roles in your career, it is really interesting to have a path that isn't necessarily defined. You mentioned something about that already. So what were your biggest challenges in these opportunities, and who or where did you look up for inspiration when it was a completely new thing?
Yeah, I think there's a great freedom in being marginalized or minoritized, right? So traditionally, when we come into leadership and we start to build our careers, we are given certain amounts of power according to our job title. But if you are anybody other than a cis-het white man, you might have to prove yourself more. And so I've built a career on influence rather than power and ownership. It's not been given to me. It's not been readily accepted. I walk into rooms and people don't want to listen to what I say because of the body I'm in. Not always, but sometimes. But that is actually my greatest strength. And within that strength, it's meant that when I'm selling something new, I'm already getting questions. So I might as well have questions about what I'm telling people to do and what's possible as well. And that has been the thing that's really helped me move forward. I saw you smile at that. Is that something you recognize yourself?
Yeah. And how has the relationship with brands changed with COVID and the pandemic? What do you think about this?
I think we're at a really interesting point in history. Just before COVID, we'd started to recognize that the definition of fame had started to change again. A 10-year-old knows the name of the person that set up Amazon. But not only that, leaders on the world stage are looking like people who run businesses. And if you've got a C-suite in your title, you can take up space if you want to. So we're starting to see a certain humanity towards people. Doesn't mean we're necessarily like the leaders, but it does mean we start to know when someone has a divorce, when someone's lifestyle changes, and we start to see them as humans again. We know their faces, we know their names, and we're starting to know their personalities. I think COVID has changed for brands in that we've all shown our vulnerability. I never would have imagined that before COVID, I would care about my supermarket supplier bringing me food. And actually that could be a life or death decision. At the point when 1,000 people were dying at the very early days of COVID, if you could get a slot for your supermarket to deliver food, could actually be a way to protect yourself from death ultimately. And what I found is lots of those brands who had those essential roles were also willing to show their vulnerability, that eagerness to support. And we now live in a world where it's very normal to say, thank goodness for Pfizer. Who would have thought we'd have spoken so positively and emotively about a big pharmaceutical or about the bank? It's changed the way we engage with organizations and brands. We're seeing them as collectives of people who are just as flawed and vulnerable and just as impressionable and just as keen to help as we are.
It's interesting that you mentioned banks as well. I have quite some problems with banks usually. And do you think there are both positive and negative things in these changes that have occurred with brands?
I mean, I do think there can be negative changes as well. I think we've lost a lot of our agency as individuals, as consumers, and a lot has been stripped from us. And what I'm starting to see now is two things: that consumers have the ability to start to think about things that are beyond their immediate world. We're not just thinking about our family, our neighborhood, COVID, how to get to work. We have capacity again to show emotion, to show engagement, but we're also wanting our autonomy back. It's not good enough if our energy supplier isn't doing what we need to on climate change. It's not good enough if our bank was wonderful on our mortgage payments in COVID, but has suddenly tightened the belt again. So I think we are pushing more and expecting more of brands in a way that we didn't before. And I think there's also a really interesting idea around how will the people who are leading now be judged in the future. So when we look at CEOs, we look at boards, in the next 10 or 20 years, will we be saying, what did you do in the climate crisis? And what did you do during COVID? Of course we will. But we're starting to try to recognize now that those of us in power will be judged by society, and we need to make sure we're doing that.
It's the next question is kind of related. So you also mentioned in an article, in this fragile new world, brands should remember that you don't need to save the world to be repositioned, but you just need to recognize the power of brands in the world, a power and a responsibility to do things differently. So should brands be more like Spider-Man and remember that with great powers comes great responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. If we think about organized change in the world, we need a body that already exists to be able to create that organized change. That can be government and legislation. That can be a platform, a technology platform like TikTok. We see people coming together on TikTok to affect change. Whether we agree with that change or like that change depends on what corner of TikTok you're on, but it's happening in all different corners. But the other option is, of course, corporations. Corporations are organized bodies that have the ability to make change. But I think it's very interesting to recognize that if we want, as individuals, to connect with brands, it doesn't just have to be about doing good. It doesn't just have to be about saving the world. It has to be about authenticity. And I'm really interested today in brands being able to represent, we see it very well in D2C companies, represent who they are and why they exist, the corporate philosophy of being present in the world and what they want to be able to do. And they just need to have a good link. It's not the Mad Men 1960s snake oil persuasion anymore. It's about saying, this is who we are. And if this is who you are, you will align with us and we will choose to work together and you'll choose to buy from us. It's not hard. We don't have to convince you. We simply have to show you who we are.
And what do you think will be the role for the industry moving forward?
I think we're going to see a very interesting split between products that don't need brands at all, products that have evolved so much they are functional. It doesn't matter who you buy from. If you think about things like your washing up liquid, possibly even your dishwasher, all dishwashers clean your dishes perfectly. They all know to be quiet at night so it doesn't wake the baby, and they're all starting to be green. And so actually, in theory, brand strips away there. But equally, there's going to be products where brand is essential, and we again get to use our autonomy as individuals, as consumers, to align with those brands that we want to. And I think that is where the industry is going to lean into, to recognize those brands, being leaders on the world stage, participating beyond where that product is, and using that power, which usually comes from size, sometimes it comes from legacy. And I think Coca-Cola is one of the most interesting brands to exist today, and it's got nothing to do with a delicious drink in a plastic bottle. It's got everything to do with the reach that they have and the power that they have, the connection they have with children, with adults, with parents. There's so much they can do with that.
Do you think consumers are much powerful than ever?
I think every pound or yen or whatever you've got in your pocket is a vote. And I think we're starting to use that again. I think we have a lot of choice, but I also think that we have so much need for different pulls on attention that a lot of the time we want the job done. We don't spend as much time luxuriating. You and I would have grown up going down the high street on a Saturday and looking in the windows and desiring clothes or desiring objects, and going to check out a new piece of tech, saving up for it and buying it. That has really stripped away now. Convenience and speed means that we don't spend as much time with most objects. You get super fans. I spent over 20 hours researching the headphones that I bought, and then several people said, "Oh, you've got the best headphones, tell me what they are." Sometimes you're sitting at the dinner table and people want the 5-minute speech, and sometimes they just want the link, and either's fine, but that doesn't exist all the time. So I think what we are seeing is those super users, consumers who want to share information and tell other people. But if consumers want to have more power, they need to spend more time shopping.
And in another article, you wrote about seizing the direct-to-consumer opportunity. You said, perhaps the C in D2C shouldn't be direct-to-consumer, but rather direct-to-community. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is so important. So we think about direct to consumer being often these small startups with a founder that's very present. We've got a real sense of the culture of that person, what they represent. Good Americans are a really good example. So this is a woman, Emma Greed, who on having her second baby realized her jeans didn't fit as well as she wanted to, and she had to stop wearing jeans. And she did everything anyone should do when they're thinking about body, and they found someone who represents that really well, went into business with a Kardashian, and formed Good American, which are jeans that fit women of any body size and any body shape. And what she's found is by having that authentic story, she was able to connect with what it means to have clothes that feel good and look good on you. So she's thinking about how women are seen in the world, and how they want to be comfortable as well for something as ubiquitous as a pair of jeans. I know all this about her because she shares her story so openly. She talks about it earnestly, and she talks about her own body and what it means for her. She's not selling, she's building a community. And I think that's what direct community is. It's so important. We see it with Glossier as well. A desire to be part of something that represents you. It's the connection. All humans want a connection. We do it when we're dating, and we do it when we're in the office. We're looking for something. And brands have the ability, especially D2C brands, to build that community authentically. And I absolutely love Emma, and I've never met her. And I would rather buy jeans from her than anyone else because I believe in her and it feels like a person. It feels like an authentic connection. And that can be true if you are a multi-million-pound conglomerate. You can still find a connection with the people you work with and the people you sell to.
What work or projects are you most proud of that you can tell us about?
Yeah, that's really hard. Yeah. And there's always the desire to talk about the project that's happening right now that you can't talk about. for me, I have this little bar that sits all of the time that says, what's the most impact I've had with the work that I can do? If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, what are people going to be talking about at my eulogy? Someone pointed out to me how dark that is the other day, but I do actually really, really think it's a good measure. How will I be viewed when I'm not there to represent myself? And for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing has to be about climate change. It has to be about the ability we have to affect others. So I'm working with a impact tech organization called Duconomy, and this amazing bunch of Swedish economists who are also working with the United Nations and working with MasterCard to be able to help people, any one of us, to track when we make a purchase, the two price tags, the financial price tag and the climate impact price tag as well. And that ability to do that, whether you are super rich billionaire or whether you're counting every penny, and you can help make those decisions there. It's not always the most expensive option, but it's about seeing what you can do. So that's really meaningful to me. But also I find that the type of work I'm doing that is of greatest consequence personally is work that brings us together. And I'm really interested in how sometimes technology pulls us apart and other times technology brings us together as well. And I think you and I are sitting here through a screen, and screens feed the eyes, but they starve the other senses. It would be different if we were sitting in a coffee shop, right? It would be different and it's closer. But also there's a thing where screens increase our desire to connect. I have to be more vulnerable with you in order to connect with you because we're not in the same room. We're doing it through a screen. And I think that's only a good thing. We will bond because of this. At the very beginning of the pandemic, I was asked to lecture at a US university, and I met the lecturer, and we would, the job was, right, let's discuss what you want to talk about, this many students. And this was very, very early on in the pandemic. And I said, how are you? And she said, I've got a job on the East Coast and I've had to move back to the West Coast to be with my parents because we think it's the safest thing. And I don't know what that's going to do for my job. I don't know what it's going to do for my students, what it's going to do for my body clock working in a different time zone. And it's literally, I'd said, hi, how are you? And she said, desperately needed to talk about how she was feeling. And it felt amazing. And this woman is now my friend. She's coming to London and I'll give her a tour. And how nice is that? Like, that wouldn't have happened had we met in a time where we hadn't had to push through technology to get closer. We might have just had a very polite coffee and I'd have talked to the students and shook her hand and I'd have been gone.
I like that very much. And can you tell us about any current project you're working on, or you can't?
I don't know. Is there anything? I'm trying to think about what's relevant. I can tell you about something that's just come out that I think is really important. So Karmarama, the group that I work in quite a lot for Accenture, just released a piece of work about people in the armed forces. And the piece of work was around how failure is a route to success, how everybody needs to fail in order to get to where they are today. And telling stories about people who are in jobs that are absolutely essential, very scary, very, very real, and of great consequence, and yet also how it's okay to fail to get to where you are today. And that really, really touched me, not just for young people. Obviously, the armed forces are looking at people who are sort of 18 to 24, beginning their first careers. But I think that's relevant for all of us today. And how useful is it and relevant is it to remember that that failure is actually a fantastic thing. And it can teach us. It can also tell us what we don't like. It can tell us, you didn't like doing that. Why was that? And so I really, really enjoyed that piece of work. And again, I think it goes to that theme of this period of time where we've all been turned inside out. And so we're showing a vulnerability. And aren't we closer for that?
Yeah, and also looking inside ourselves, no? During this time. Yeah. And so last question to wrap up. In 2021, and after a very special and different pandemic 2020, where lockdowns collectively stripped our freedoms and existence, you said in an article, it was a year for radical ideas. So which radical ideas would you like to see this 2022?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you. For me, I think a radical idea looks like a leap that isn't understood by logic alone. It can't make sense. It shouldn't exist on a spreadsheet. And I think one of the leaps I want to see is for our industry to have the freedom of how we work. In the Second World War, women entered the workforce because men were in the front line, and women were allowed to wear trousers. And at the end of the war, nobody could take women's rights away in terms of how they dressed and the fact that they were part of the workforce. And I think all of us collectively, whatever our identity, it's really, really important as the world opens up again, that we look to dismantle the space we've worked in as an industry, but anyone who works in an office, to say, do we need to work 9 to 5? Do we need to be present all of the time? I found people who've worked with me have told me their anxiety has reduced during a global pandemic because they don't have to be present in the office every day, or because they don't have to get to work at 9 o'clock. Now, if your anxiety reduces while you are in fear of an invisible virus that could kill you or kill someone you love, how good would it be if we had freedom at work when that virus is no longer a threat? And that's what I want.
Yeah, really looking forward to that moment also, when the virus is not again, it's not with us anymore. Okay, so thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all your answers, and wishing you all the best for all your new projects and everything coming up.
You too. Bye-bye.